All right, we're back.
Cool. So continuing on. Also, before you got the first row.
Second row as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Cheers.
Continuing on, the next thing we're going to look at is actually in the IMGUI library, which I found and reported afterwards, so that's been fixed. But it's yeah, it's actually a sort of easy one, or at least finding the issue is easy. Essentially, because IMGUI, which you will hopefully be, or which we will probably maybe force you to use, just because it's nice, has this demo window where they show off most of their functionality, and one of the things they show off is how they have a clip-in box, and you can sort of change the size of that clip-in box. And however, if you sort of drag that size too low, then it crash.
Oh, nice.
And that's what we're going to try and find out why it crashed. That's the bug. We've already gotten some information already. You know, we know that somewhere around here this bug happened. So,
is this one you have figured out for yourself yet?
no, I figured it out.
Okay.
And we also reported on, and it's been fixed. Yes.
Well, what's the value where it crashes? Do you know? Or is it, there was like a number showing the size or something.
Yeah. So the value, that's the size arg, it's 0 and 100.
Yeah, I meant like at what value was crashing, because my first instinct would be that some weird divide by 0 error or something, but that's probably not.
No, it's not. It's not a divide by 0, but you're getting there. It has something to do with values.
Yeah, below 0.
What do you say?
Below 0?
Below 0? No, it's not that it's below 0. So, before we're sort of continuing guessing, does anyone have any idea on what we should do? So, like, we know that it crashes somewhere around here. Is there any way we can get sort of more information going out there? Yes?
Maybe go to the top of the function and set a breakpoint there.
Yeah. So we can do that. And this is where it gets fun, because now the sort of breakpoint is going to trigger every frame.
Oh my.
So it's going to be hard to drag it. However, it is possible, like IMGUI allows you to do that, I just don't remember how. But it is possible to find it out even though we don't have the breakpoint there, if we don't crash again. However, setting the breakpoint, if you have the sort of option to do it, if it's not like you're calling this a framework and you remember the way that you can get IMGUI to just trigger when you want it to trigger, then you know that's a correct solution. Like set the breakpoint there and see what's going on. However, you can still get a bunch of that information if we go here and sort of trigger it, because what we got. So if we just look at the code and sort of read the code from top to bottom, we know that we're getting in 0 and 100. So, and sort of another sort of thing that you may not know is that this arrow here means that we haven't executed this piece of code yet.
There's a cert that X should not be 0.
Yeah. So that's sort of the issue here. That's why we're crashing. Everyone remember me talking about assert yesterday? Right?
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, IMGUI and a lot of other libraries has a bunch of asserts, and it's it's good because then we're getting told that we are using the interface wrong. And in this case, what happens is that, as I said there, you can't use 0 size for invisible button. Unlike button, there is no fallback to using the label size. And so what that means is essentially when you normally create a button, you give it a text, and then you also give it a size. And if that size is 0, then it will sort of calculate the size based on what's inside the label. So what's supposed to be written on the button. However, since it's an invisible button, you cannot actually do that because it doesn't have any labels. So now we're sort of figuring, but this is where it crashes. But now we have to figure out why, or this is where it terminates. Crashes is like crashing on purpose. So yeah, luckily we have our call stack here, so we can just give it a good. You know, here we will have sort of the call stack of the program. So what functions were called before us? So we'll just double click and see that we get over here, which, you know, we create the 3-node clipping, and this is where we are, you know, crashing, or sorry, this is where we are crashing, and that's because the size is 0. We've sort of been confirmed that because that's what we get down at the other side. So why does it turn into 0? So I guess I can give a sort of a brief explanation of what happens in the code here, so that you can sort of relate that to what's going on screen. What I'll do is that I'll not trigger debug, and then we'll just sort of look at the code next to it. So what you see here is that this is super hard to see. So this 3-node here, where it says like if 3-node, that's for this functionality, for just opening and closing that. Then you can see here that just like IMGUI text wrap, which is then writing out this text. And then it does a drag float, which is a size, and then you see it says size there, and this is like the floats you can drag. And then this is the text wrap, that's the click and drag, as you can see here, and then it does like it calculates some positions and some other stuff, and then it draws an invisible button, which we can't, you know, see here because it's invisible, using the size. Yes?
The drag float is allowed to go from 0 to 200, so you can probably stop it before 0.
And how do you know that it's allowed to go from 0 to 200?
The parameter before 200 is the range.
Cool. That's correct. So looking at sort of the documentation for IMGUI, you will see that this function will take in like the label, or we can actually go and see it. So you will see here that, you know, it takes a label, it takes an array, or in this case it's sort of treated as a pointer. It takes a speed, so how fast you're supposed to drag it back and forth, and then it takes a minimum and a maximum. And the minimum it supplies is 0, which is then problematic because invisible buttons aren't allowed to have the value of 0. So how do we fix this?
Set it to 1.
Yes. And that's also the official fix. That's the one that like got merged in. So if we then run it, then we'll see that, you know, we can't drag it to 1. So cool. So we just fixed the bug in the library. It's a small one, but it's still, you know, considering this is the demo video, it's not necessarily fun to sort of have stuff breaking in your demo window, where you're supposed to like show how neat the library is. Cool. So that's one more down. That means we only have one bug left, which is a shame. Or we probably have more left. It's just I don't know about it.
Probably fine though. That's fine.
Yeah. So here's sort of a demonstration of the issue. So I open up to inspect a program, and then this one was Halvor, you were the one that found this one, yes? That, you know, I can show the shader source, etc. However, if I open up the first program, you'll see everything is expanded already, and I'm suddenly highlighting stuff that's like at both places. I can't click anything down here, and if I click up here, then both headers fold. Same with the uniforms. So where do we start?
Find out where you're making the drop down menus.
Yep. So the drop down menus, and for those of you who know InGUI in and out, not allowed to point out the mistakes straight away. Yeah, so that's here. And then some breakpoint, or
Sure, that's okay. Though we won't have the same issue as last time where
yeah.
so let's not send breakpoint.
Cool. So, but at least we have sort of found where we think the issue is. We think the issue is sort of, you know, around here. So, what's all the stuff on screen that we don't know? Sort of. Like, it's a lot of GL code, but that's probably not relevant here. Sort of spoiler, I'm not throwing in another me messing up the size of pointers and the size of integers again. So that's not the issue.
Something with names.
Could. But if we look at the, we'll see that they actually have, or which duplicate names are you thinking of?
Like uniform shaders and shaders.
Yeah, that could be one of the issues.
So the highlighting bug makes me think that there's, I mean, it's obviously some issue with like whatever identifier you're using isn't really key. So it's like finding optimal. How that works.
So, the GFX library has a bunch of green text, which is called documentation, which explains how stuff works.
It's a good feature.
It's a really good feature, and you'll see a lot of libraries have this sort of functionality. You know, where they supply documentation. And anytime you sort of get across using a new library, or in general, you should read documentation. So with all those hints, what's probably the next step that we should go and
Read the documentation.
Yes. So, you know, if let's start at the top, because that's where the function starts, and we're sort of already getting the problem quite early. So let's go to InGUI.h and see what it says here. The first thing it says is, you know, look at the demo code, etc. And you know, read the programming guide. And I thought it actually said it more clearly, because the programming guide isn't here. The programming guide is, or it's, you know, at the thing. But it's the actual documentation of InGUI is in the CPP file, which is sort of, you know, gives a large amount of text showing how everything works. You know, I'm not going to read all of this, so I'm sort of just going to skip ahead and tell you about the stuff that is important, which is essentially that InGUI has a sort of, or I guess we can get to the point or the function itself first, which was collapsing header. Yeah, because that's the first one that we set. So yeah, here we can just see that it's not that much on the documentation here, or sort of InGUI doesn't do the sort of docs-again documentation, but they supply a lot of examples, which is another way of doing it, and that's, you know, both are sort of valid. Especially considering that they have the demo window, which shows off, you know, how are you actually supposed to use the library. But if you look at the collapsing header here, it says, like, you know, if returning true, the header is open, which means that we've, you know, opened the open header. Doesn't indent nor push on ID stack. User doesn't have to call tree path. Anyone else get any ideas on?
You didn't read out an R poetry. Might that be
Well, we're not. We can check. We're not. Sorry, could you repeat again what the?
I mean, if you don't have to call it, then my instinct would be that you have called it. So.
That I have called it. Okay, we'll check if I have called it. Let's see. So. Yeah. So. No, I haven't called it. But that's a good sort of, what you should do is that you should sort of try to come up with theories as to what could be wrong, and then quickly try to figure out whether or not that is actually the case, and then just move on and try to pick out the theories that are easy to test or to check quite early. So sort of picking that is a good choice. But that's not it. However, I have marked something here that is sort of relatively important, which probably no one sees again. It says here, doesn't indent nor push on ID stack. So the way sort of IMG functions, and this is me going, my understanding, because I'm not sort of an expert in this, but essentially they have an ID stack on the background where you sort of, normally when you create a button or something, they sort of give that button ID that is unique based on the sort of previous configuration of IMG or how it looks at the moment. So, we can have two buttons in two different windows that has the same name without any issues, because the sort of whole ID of that button is tied also to the window that it is in, or sort of the if it's under a tree node, then we also have like the ID has, or the tree node has an ID, and then the button below the tree node has an ID that's a combination of the label that we give it, or the ID that we give it, and the previous one, which is why we're allowed to have stuff that has the same name, but or the same name, but so we still get different IDs in different regions. But it says here that, doesn't indent nor push on the stack ID. Which then probably means that the reason that I now can suddenly sort of manipulate both of these at the same time is because they end up with the same ID. So IMG sort of checks, is this thing with this ID highlighted, and then it goes on, or hovered, and then it goes and highlights everything with that ID. So cool. Everyone sort of got that, or cool. So how do we fix it?
Ensure they are unique. No.
That's one way of fixing it. So how would you propose ensuring that they are unique?
Make the object for each one separately, if that's already done.
Okay. So, because the thing is that we get the sort of label that we're using. So this, if we had a tree here instead of a collapsing header, then that would have the label as ID pushed onto the stack as well. So we're not sort of getting we're getting our IDs from the outside. So, hold on. Could you again repeat what you were actually proposing? Because I sort of lost it.
I think it was just to try to make them separate objects. I don't know. I'm not experienced with this library.
No, that's good. We could try to find different ways of making it unique. So, for instance, what we could do is, for instance, sort of append that we don't just write uniforms, we also write, uniforms and then the ID of the program, for instance. So we create, a buffer, and then we say that, car buffer 28, and then we can just do uniforms and then program. And we send in here buffer. I think that might fix it. See. So yeah, that will fix it. You know, then we get the sort of unique uniforms. Was that sort of what you were thinking, or
Something like that.
yeah? So that's one way of fixing it, or sort of dealing with the issue. I spoke too soon.
Half the issue is solved.
Half the issue is solved.
What's interesting is it looks like it only does that if you highlight the top one, not the bottom one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then we highlight.
Okay.
Interesting.
Right.
But hey, we fixed parts of the problem, so you know, still that's progress. So you still don't know much about IMGUI. That's, you know, understandable. We're sort of introducing it now. So what should you do when you don't know?
Documentation.
Yes. So it says here that, you know, it doesn't indent nor push ID on stack, which means that we have the concept of an ID somewhere. So let's just see if we go like ID, what do we get? So here we get some like tree push. Well, we get a lot of void stuff. That's not the intention. However, it says something interesting here. It says like, you know, when we do a tree push, that's indent plus push ID. So that means that push, and the same says that a tree pop is unindent and pop ID, which means that, you know, the concept of pushing and popping IDs. So let's try to just see what happens if we do push ID. And suddenly we have a function that's called push ID. And then it says like, you know, read the fact for more details about how IDs are handled in their IMGUI, which, you know, that means that you should actually go and do it. But it says that like, if you are creating widgets in a loop, you most likely want to push a unique identifier, i.e. object pointer or loop index, to uniquely differentiate them. And that's essentially what we're sort of doing, or to a certain degree it's what we're doing. You can also use the label and then like # foobar syntax within the widget label to distinguish them from each other. Yeah, and then it says in this header file we will also use label / name terminology to denote a string that will be displayed and the user and used as an ID, and string ID to denote a string that is only used as an ID and is not normally displayed. And if I go up again and look at the collapsing header, yeah, it takes a label. So cool, that's, well, I would say it was inconsistent if it wasn't built for the fact that it says here that it's not doing sort of not pushing to the stack. But hey, then we know that we have push and pop, so let's see if, you know, that fixes something. And you can also see stuff here that says like, you know, you can call this function called getID, where it says like calculates unique ID hash of the whole ID stack plus a given parameter, IG if you want like query into IMG storage or IMQ storage, storage yourself. But that's sort of, yeah, it gives us the impression that, you know, something is going on about the ID stuff. So let's see what happens if we just say here that we also want to do a like IMGUI push ID. And what ID are we pushing?
Program.
That's possible. However, if I supply, well, yeah, we can also push the program. It will be problematic if two people uses the same program, but that shouldn't really be happening. And then instead of here, we'll just do like uniforms. And then we also need to pop the ID at the end. And then if we open both, we'll see that they're sort of reacting independently of each other, which is what we're supposed to do. So that's sort of that it. Everyone got that? So, sort of the point of the lecture was not to sort of show off bugs. It's more showing off how you could approach them. So it's always sort of like trying to, I mean, something doesn't work, and then you need to figure out why, and you can do that in different ways. Sometimes you can set breakpoints. Sometimes it's not feasible to set breakpoints. Sometimes setting breakpoints will lead you to read values that you don't really know how to deal with at all. So, for instance, I was doing this cloth simulation where suddenly all my numbers just exploded, like seemingly random. So it just went like everywhere. And so trying to set a breakpoint and looking at all the matrix values of all the different particles within my cloth and trying to figure out how they got that way is not necessarily feasible. You have to sort of always try to find what's the best way for me to see this problem and how can I best approach it in a way that allows me to figure out what's wrong. Sometimes that's setting up breakpoints, other times that is just printing out stuff, logging, printing out values. That can also be, especially if you're using stuff like IMGUI, setting that up so that you can get out the values is super easy. So being able to like output values through IMGUI is a way that you can try to do debugging. Other things that you sort of need to do is that you need to figure out like what you know and what don't you know. In our case, we didn't know that much about IMGUI, so we had to go and do the documentation. So always have the documentation available, and always try to write documentation and read documentation. That's actually your job. Even though all programmers for some reason seem to hate it, that's a vital part of your job. And try to use all the tools that you have at your disposal and try to sort of isolate the problem as quickly as possible so that you can start testing your theories. And for each time you sort of test the theory, then you get more knowledge about what could be going on. And then just try to sort of approach it with an open mind, etc. I think that's most of what I have, unless there are some questions. I could come up, or I could tell you about some of the sort of fun bugs that I've had to deal with. That's been like super hard to debug, or where I've just chosen hacky solutions. Because it's important to see, if you have a bug and you can pick, if you have a bug and you have a sort of deadline, fixing it in the way that it's the nicest possible way to deal with this problem, where that would sort of, if it takes time, then we always have to sort of do the evaluation. Should I fix this properly, or should I just hack it and make sure that it works? And that's something you always have to think about when doing programming in general. That's why I, for instance, don't check that the sort of maximum amount of attributes you have is 1 billion or something. I just sort of made the assumption that if the standard says that you're required to at least have 4, then probably people won't have anything that is like exceeding what's reasonable to iterate through, etc. So it's sort of like looking at the situation you have at hand and trying to figure out what are reasonable choices. And also in terms of, and that also applies in terms of bugs. So I can bring up one example we had in our application development course, which you will have next semester. Yeah, if you're taking that track, where we were supposed to create a Ludo game, so which ran online. So basically, multiplayer of Ludo with like friends list and matchmaking and chat and stuff like that. And we were running a database on the server side for storing all this information. And what we would do is that when people would log on, we would sort of give them a token that uniquely identified them. And when they logged off, we would just sort of delete that token. And or we would set that token to null in the database. And what suddenly started happening was that we were working on the feature of disconnecting people when we shut down the server, so that no one would start up with sort of tokens that wasn't valid anymore. And what would start happening was that suddenly the Java runtime environment would like crash. So it's not like Java throwing an exception because I'm doing something wrong. It's like the entire, the entire program that's running my program falls apart.
Ouch.
And we were looking at sort of the logs, and it looked like sort of a risk or a multi-threading issue, but that didn't make sense because while we were using multiple threads in the program, at the point at which we were crashing, we have sort of left the multi-threaded world and gone back into a single-thread world. It was just sort of as the application was shutting down, and we, couldn't figure it out. Just got like weird random error messages most of the time. Other times it works fine, which is, the most fun errors are the ones that just appear randomly and then disappear as you're trying to deal with them. So to go on a tangent on that, you might get into issues in C++ where if you're doing stuff called undefined behavior, which is basically when you're doing stuff that's illegal for the language, or not illegal, but it's essentially just a standard that says like you can do this, but we're giving no guarantees as to what will happen, and we probably won't warn you either, because that's how C++ works. You can get into situations where you'll start to run your program, and you're going like, okay, hey, there's this variable that changes value, and it's really weird because it shouldn't be changing value. And then you add a print statement, and then suddenly your program works. Like, it doesn't change anymore. And that's just because you've sort of like manipulated the program into a state where that undefined behavior doesn't trigger in the same way anymore, for instance. And then the solution sometimes is, if you're supposed to like deliver that assignment by midnight, then the solution is to keep printing. And then just like tell your teacher that, hey, we ran into this issue. This is why, we're printing fact all the time, or something like that. Because then the program works. But yeah, so jumping back to the issue we had in application development, it was crashing the runtime environment randomly, and we spent a lot of time debugging it, and we didn't have that much, or we had a good couple of days, but we didn't want to spend that much time on fixing the actual issues. So we found out that the problem was that when we were sort of writing to our database, we never used the results of those commands, which made sense. We just want to set some stuff to null. We don't want to go and look up afterwards whether or not they are null. We don't care. We just want to sort of set them. And what the library we used then did was that it started sending those requests asynchronously. So it happened sort of in the background. We just fired it off, and then the library sort of just made the guarantee that if we ever came back to the database and sort of ran a new query, then for us it would seem as if nothing ran asynchronously. Like we were provided a sort of interface that looked single-threaded, but might not be functioning that way in the background. And that's sort of where stuff gets problematic, because that illusion was broken. That was why we ended up with the bug. Because when we were sending up all those write requests and those happening in the background, we would start shutting down the database while those asynchronous updates were still in progress. Which is then where, the whole Java runtime environment panicked, because suddenly we were like closing down objects while we were doing stuff with them, and that's super illegal. So that's always the fun part, when all the abstractions fall down. And we didn't find, it might be a way, but we didn't find any way to sort of check the library, to check like, are you done? Like, are you finished with all the requests? Can we close you now? We didn't actually find any sort of method for doing that. So our solution was just that we slept the entire application, or like the main thread, at the end of our program. So we just went like, hey, let's disconnect everyone, let's get back into the single-threaded world. And just before we said like, close the database, we just go like, sleep for, 250 milliseconds or something. And that then disappeared.
So,
in the light of the issue, I mean, you dug quite deep and found out that, okay, if you had used the return information, right, the affected rows and things like this, right? So if you would just do a check on that one, you would enforce synchronicity, right? So because you would only get the result if it's actually performed, right? So wouldn't that be the more sensible way in this particular example?
No, because we weren't doing update query where we were actually supposed to get a result back. We were just doing a straight write.
Yeah, but with those DBMS systems, you always get the number of affected rows, right? So which is kind of an error handling mechanism, right? So you can or validation that it actually were successful, right? So if you're saying update something or write something, it always will return you the number of rows affected.
Might be, but we didn't get access to that through the interface that we had available,
right.
or we didn't sort of see that as an obvious obvious thing. But yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, the story is dodgy enough, so that makes it interesting. So.
But that was it was the correct decision to take at that time. And sometimes that's what you do. Like if you, especially if you go to game dev and read about all the sort of amazing hacks that people do, both to fix bugs and to just ensure that they ship games. Yeah, just read through that, because that's like enlightening, and it will show like how people get creative when it's limited resources. And
don't
know when to use them and know when not to use them, which is
that is the important thing.
The time.
If it works, it works.
Yeah. Well, the question is, do you need to maintain it or not, right? So if it's like a one-off thing, like a game often, right? So you want to get it out in 3 months, no one plays it anymore anyway. Well, I guess saturating here. Then it doesn't really matter. But if you're planning for an application that runs 20 or 30 years, or at least 10 anyway, then you better get it right? So
that's the same. Like for us, the sleep, like for us that works. That was a satisfying solution, because one, it fixed the issue, and we didn't have to spend any more time on it. And it just happened as you were sort of shutting down the problem anyway. So it wasn't sort of like, it didn't mess up the chance of running the program later. It didn't disturb the database. It just meant that the person who shut down the sort of application, which runs on an isolated server, so that's not an issue having to wait there, had to sort of wait an extra 250 milliseconds, which isn't a lot of time. It's like, it's less time than what most programs these days use to shut down when you're trying to turn off your computer. So, it's sort of always risk-benefit analysis. However, the problem is, of course, if this application were to blow up for some reason, like, everyone would be playing it, then we would get into issues, because if like 100,000 people were connected at the same time, and we sort of started that database transaction, 250 milliseconds might not be enough for the whole database to sort of finish writing, and then we would get into that issue again.
Clearly, you just sleep for a number of milliseconds equal to the number of players.
That's possible, yeah.
Sleep for 100,000 milliseconds. That sounds like a good.
That's good. Yeah, scale the problem.
Scale a minute.
But yeah, so hopefully you got some insight into debugging, or I've given you some sort of ideas on where you can start looking. And if there's any questions, then just shout. And then we'll be looking more into both ImGUI and GFX, the sort of introspection stuff. First, once it's finished, and secondly, when we get around to the sort of graphics debugging session.
Yeah. Where do we find the GFX and such?
It's on the GitLab page. Not the newest one, because I didn't want to push the ones that have these bugs fixed or highlighted. But I'll get it up during the day.
Cool.
Did you show conditional breakpoints?
No, I can show conditional breakpoints really quickly. Essentially, when you set a breakpoint like this, you can also like right-click and say conditions, where you can sort of like write a condition within, let's say that we were only supposed to break if type is equal to 1, for instance. What this essentially means, you'll see there that you get a plus on the breakpoint, and that essentially means exactly what it says. It's that, if the variable type is equal to 1 and we sort of get to this line, then we will actually stop the breakpoint, then we will actually do the breakpoint. which could be a cool way to debug your loop. Like, you know, if you know that you failed on the 100th element, you don't want to sit and, you know, click.
Oh, the pain of that one.
Yeah, you don't want to sit and click, you know, each time. So you would just say like, you know, why, or set a breakpoint when I is equal to 100.
A very hacky assert. Just have a breakpoint, which is an assert, but it will only work for you.
You can also do what we're thinking of doing. So currently the GFX assert just terminates the application, and we're looking into sort of expanding that so it also opens if you're like running Visual Studio or you're running some other IDE, where we can sort of know which IDE that you're running. So for instance, if you're compiling with MSC or the Windows compiler, then we're going to assume that you're running Visual Studio, because that's usually what people do. So we'll then supply it so that, you know, if you assert, then we'll set a debug break so that, you know, you'll open the debugger at the place where we have the assert.
Nice.
But we can't do that necessarily anywhere, or at least we can supply you ways to configure that, and we'll do that, but we can't sort of supply it by default on every platform. So I'll sort of write a piece of documentation saying like, hey, here's how you send off your own sort of assert breaking thing.
What are people in the past actually using?
Yeah.
Are you using Windows or Linux, and which drivers?
Who's using Windows with Visual Studio? That's about 80%, okay. And the rest, which IDE are you using? Yeah. Xcode, right? Yes, on you.
Windows.
When Visual Studio or something? Yeah. You just raised your hand, okay. Any other exotic IDE or the like? No? Consensus Visual Studio?
Cool, then we'll introduce it for Visual Studio, and then I'll look at what is needed for
Xcode. Yeah, cool.
Xcode